Hello and welcome to the Baumer Conversations. I'm Justin Parscher and I teach in landscape here at Knowlton. And I'm very happy to welcome today to our studios in the great frozen north of Ohio, three representatives from the Kounkuey Design Initiative. Welcome to the Baumer. These folks are here. Technical error. They're here as our Glimcher distinguished professors for this year. Every year we invite folks from around the world of landscape practice here to Knowlton and work with us here, faculty and students alike. In the past, this has usually been one person or a partnership, and we're really happy this year to welcome in KDI as a group. Why did we want to invite KDI in? Because among many other reasons, they have 15 years of hard work put in on developing a model of practice that really works with under-resourced communities and builds a new vision of what could work for a sustainable and equitable future. So doing that through design, through landscape architecture, through planning, through advocacy, through education, and a multitude of other things as well. So please join me in welcoming, we've got here Chelina Odbert, the Executive Director, Jerome Chou, the Planning Director, and giving our introductory lecture today is Elachi, the Senior Design Coordinator. So welcome all.
Thank you.
Great, so if it's all right, I will go ahead and share my screen. This may take a second. All right. Great, so hello everybody. Good evening or good afternoon. We're based in sunny California, so I'm really luxuriating in that at the moment. But thank you so much for the invitation to talk here today, Justin. And like I said, my name is Elachi. I am the Senior Design Coordinator at Kounkuey Design Initiative. My colleagues, Chelina and Jerome, will be joining us later for the discussion in the Q&A portion of the event. So as Justin was mentioning, KDI is a nonprofit, mission-driven design practice that works with under-resourced communities to build equity in neighborhoods and cities. And we do this in four primary ways: through design and implementation, through planning and innovative programming, through policy change and advocacy, and action research. And we're an office of landscape architects, urban planners, community organizers, and engineers, just to name a few of our very varied backgrounds. We work in 4 different offices across the globe. As I said, myself, Chelina, and Jerome are based in Los Angeles, but we additionally have offices in the Eastern Coachella Valley, in Stockholm, Sweden, and Nairobi, Kenya. I'll mostly be talking about the projects in our US offices today, but we can get more into the Kenya-based work as well in the Q&A. So tonight, what I'd like to talk to you all about is what design to us looks like in a time of a global pandemic, in a time of a racial reckoning in this country, climate disaster, economic downturn, and political polarization, which can also be known as design during what is seeming like a continuation of 2020. Sorry to be the pessimist in the Zoom room here. But one thing that these topics have in common is that they have thrown the disparities across our nation and our planet in health, in economics, race relations, and environmental justice into such stark relief that the average person in the United States can no longer conveniently ignore these facts. So that these disparities exist is hopefully not new information to this audience today. But what I want to put before us is this: Does this mean that we as design professionals are superfluous to changing our country's and our planet's trajectory? Or are we in fact essential to catalyzing and bringing forth that change? So as a justice-based design firm, you can probably guess how we would answer that question. But I want to make the argument that doing this work on these issues as designers is absolutely essential, is the essential heart of our professions. It seems we all agree that our job is to shape the built environment, and we do so to create positive experiences for people, protect wildlife, enhance infrastructure. But what we may be missing or not thinking about as often is that the built environment is not a neutral backdrop. It is in fact an active and critical character in shaping how the narratives of racial justice, public health, climate resilience, and economic development play out. And so I can give a brief example of what I mean by that. So a growing body of research shows that zip code is the greatest predictor of life expectancy in the United States. People living just a few blocks away from one another may have vastly different opportunities to live a long life, in part because of their neighborhood. So take the difference between Malibu, where the average life expectancy is almost 90 years, and Watts, which is a neighborhood in South LA, where it is approximately 75 years. And so though these places are just miles apart, though granted that can be hours based on Los Angeles traffic, growing up in Watts likely means that you will experience almost 15 fewer years of life just because of your zip code and local built environment. So that disparity is overwhelmingly attributed to differences in access. The things that move the needle the most are access to social infrastructure. In many neighborhoods, there's clearly unequal investment in essential spaces to build community, like schools or community centers or public spaces. Access to safety. So that may include safe streets, affordable housing, and robust transportation networks. And lastly, access to a healthy environment. So this is the ability to live away from environmental hazards or pollution, reliable basic infrastructure such as water or sanitation, and the ability to withstand climate disasters. And so, of course, designers create all of these things. We design and build public spaces, streets, housing, transportation networks, infrastructure. And so as an industry, we need to broaden our modes of practice beyond a practice that primarily creates these services when invited by a client to practices that catalyze and instigate their creation. So to us at KDI, design is inherently an activist position, and we espouse an activism that sees and hears where design is missing and vigorously pursues getting it there. So I'll be talking about, for the remainder of this introductory lecture, 5 different ways that we do this in our practice through seeding, sponsoring, pitching, scaling, and inserting. And each of these tactics represents a way that we initiate our own projects. So that is, these are all projects for which there was no request for proposals or RFP or call from a client to respond to. So I'll look briefly at a project from our portfolio that shows how this approach was used, and then we can dive into the specifics during the Q&A session as well. So first, I'll talk about the seed project. So a seed project in our office is where we use a little bit of our own money or our own funding to offer a certain amount of free work to a client, and using that first seed as a way for it to make it easier for a client to say yes, take away some of the risk that they may be fearful of, or give them the ability to have enough time to put together the resources and the political will needed to see the next steps of the project forward. So I will illustrate this concept through our Eastern Coachella Valley PPS network. And we often shorten the Eastern Coachella Valley to ECV. So if I'm saying that throughout the presentation, that's what I'm talking about. So the Coachella Valley of California is home to some of the wealthiest amenity-rich zip codes in the country, including Palm Springs, and many of you may be familiar with the Coachella Music Festival, which also happens in this area. But the valley has a very visible line between the east portion and the west portion, which you can actually literally see in the quality of the asphalt as you are driving from one portion to the other, with the eastern Coachella Valley, where we work, having almost 40% of its population living below the poverty line. It is dotted with farm worker communities that feed the nation and provide 70% of the winter produce that we all eat, but has very few public amenities. And though the Parks Department that works throughout the entire valley wanted to bring parks to the eastern portion of the valley, their hands were essentially tied because their internal formula for paying for a park was based on parameters such as population density, and that just didn't add up in the eastern Coachella Valley. So using some internal seed funding, we offered the Parks Department free design services to put together a concept design through a process that partnered with community members, and an alternative financing structure for a park that brought together the funding they do have with other funding that we could leverage. They agreed, and over time we were able to build a community park designed through a participatory process with community members, which has become a lively public space and the first of its kind in the eastern Coachella Valley, and also supports local micro-entrepreneurship opportunities for community members. From there, the seed kept growing, as seeds are wont to do. And once the Parks Department could see for themselves that this strategy worked, they hired us with their own funds to repeat the process in a neighboring community of Oasis. And that park just broke ground for construction last month. And then later, that process was integrated into their formal request for proposals language for a third park in the area, which we are also now working on. And so while a seed investment was needed to catalyze the work at the beginning, quickly the project shifted to a typical fee-for-service type arrangement, and 3 parks that would otherwise not exist in this area soon will. The next project tactic that I'll talk about is what we call a sponsor project. So it sounds pretty much like it is, tapping into an entity other than our client to pay for the work. For a nonprofit like ourselves, we often do that by looking to foundations, individual donors, and government agency grants. So in California, our state transportation agency, which is called Caltrans, as well as many regional conservancies, offer grant funding for projects defined by the applicant. And that's exactly how we funded our ECV mobility planning work. So with our park work underway in this area, it became very clear very quickly that reaching these public spaces would be difficult, given that there are essentially no sidewalks throughout this entire region, no bike lanes, and very sparse public transit. So when we investigated why the West Valley, as in Palm Springs, had all of these elements and the East Valley had virtually none, we discovered that what was missing in the East were county-approved mobility plans, which would then allow the county to tap into state funds to provide for such infrastructure. So we used a Caltrans grant to lead a mobility plan process on behalf of the county and with residents to determine current barriers to mobility, which often also translates to barriers to economic opportunity. And we designed where and what the streetscape and mobility network should be and how it could benefit that community. This mobility plan was then adopted by the county, and almost immediately the county was able to successfully win multiple millions of dollars to implement the first phase of this network. And again, this work catalyzed more work, and since that adoption of the first plan, we wrote 2 more mobility plans for the other areas within the eastern Coachella Valley, which have also been adopted at this point. So using these extra funding sources to create our own brief and sponsor the work helped ease the burden for identifying paths to implementation and on-the-ground action, giving the county the necessary tools to start making tangible change. So the third initiation tactic that we use is what we call the pitch. So this also sounds very similar to what it is. We ourselves identify a transformative project and pitch it to an agency or other entity that we believe should or could be implementing that work. So this This tactic works particularly well in cities that are relatively progressive in their thinking around public space, of which we consider Los Angeles to be one. And one of the big issues in Los Angeles that we've been wrestling with is that half of the city does not have easy access to a park, unlike other places like San Francisco or Washington, D.C. And the half that lacks that access overlays almost exactly with LA's low-income communities of color. At the same time, we all know that building permanent parks can be a real challenge and take an incredibly long time. So we were looking for ways to make quality public spaces available to children and adults right now, while pursuing the longer-term goal of permanent public space. And if you've ever visited Los Angeles, you'll know that one thing we do have plenty of is streets. And so we developed a program called Play Streets with residents that would transform neighborhood blocks into temporary but reoccurring public spaces, which was focused in low-income communities throughout Los Angeles and used elements that we ourselves designed, including a multifunctional piece that we call the Wobble, though I have heard very many small children calling it the caballito, which also means the little horse. And so we thought this would be a perfect project for the city's Department of Transportation. So we pitched it to them. They liked it and agreed to pay for us to develop it from day one. And after 2 successful pilot phases, it is now on its way to becoming a permanent citywide program. So finding a willing and like-minded partner, like the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, created the opportunity to have buy-in and pursue innovation as we piloted, tested, and refined what had started as a pitch and now has become this permanent citywide program. So moving on, the 4th tactic that I will be talking about is scale. So in many ways, the 3 projects that I've already spoken about embrace this idea of scale, but it's really this idea of starting small, building a proof of concept, and then being able to scale it up. So this is particularly true of our research work around gendered public space and exploring how public spaces can be designed to work better for women and girls. So this work started through a partnership with the World Bank and the Argentine Ministry, and we engaged women in the settlement of La Favorita, which is an informal settlement in Mendoza, Argentina, to understand linkages between gender, public space, and the informal urban realm. As part of that work, we facilitated walk audits, local tours, and sensitization activities to understand how the built environment affects local women's lives. And these women then developed concept plans for a specific plaza within their city that would better meet their needs. These plans then formed the basis for a design studio at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where students created formalized pitches for the city of Mendoza to implement. And actually, one of those proposals is being brought forward by the city as the new park design in this space. So resulting from that really grounded work, we scaled way up to working with the World Bank to draft their handbook on gender inclusive urban planning and design. Drawing on our experience in La Favorita and elsewhere, we laid out how to create best practices and conduct engagement that elevates the voices of women and girls, and highlighted key case studies that have succeeded in achieving gender inclusion goals, resulting in a handbook that has direct practical guidance for World Bank staff on how to implement urban development projects that forefront gender equality throughout the built environment. So this process of creating small-scale proofs of concept, in this case, the on-the-ground research in Argentina, for the leverage needed to affect policy change has allowed KDI to be a thought leader within the field of gender equitable design and create this opportunity and handbook for others to then use that information in their work as well. And so lastly, I will talk about the tactic of insert, because, just to be blunt, sometimes you just need to insert yourself into the conversation to make the change that is needed. While at many scales, this holds true across the KDI practice, both in our projects and in the mindsets that we all have, it is particularly clear in our environmental justice project at the Salton Sea, which is California's largest lake. The Salton Sea, which is adjacent to the communities that we serve in the eastern Coachella Valley, is quickly shrinking due to a combination of climate change and water right reallocations. In turn, this exposes dust laced with agricultural runoff, creating hazardous air quality conditions for a region that already has twice the asthma rate of the rest of California. Additionally, the Salton Sea is hypersaline, so that's like the Great Salt Lake or the Dead Sea. And the shrinking has led to a spike in that salinity, causing large fish die-offs, and then in turn, a decrease in the bird populations that depend on them. So in response to this crisis, the state government essentially created a specific goal of habitat restoration, but forgot about the fact that there were a lot of people living around the sea as well, and so that critical voice was not part of the conversation. Time and again, in all of our projects, we heard from community members that something needed to be done. So in response, we partnered with 6 other nonprofits to create an environmental justice advocacy campaign that worked to bring together the power of storytelling, youth advocacy, and community science to gather data on shoreline recession. Building a base of active residents, we have since been able to engage with the state's Natural Resources Agency to help them frame a new path forward that prioritizes habitat, yes, as well as community public health, creating a vision for the Salton Sea that emphasizes social resiliency. And we are now working on a pilot project that looks to test multi-beneficial infrastructure along the sea's shoreline. So in short, we didn't wait for permission or an invitation to start working on these issues facing the community, but rather built up the data and the narrative necessary to put pressure on and convince the state that action was essential to creating a more equitable approach. So to sum it up, we are not working under any illusions that design can solve all the planet's problems. It can't single-handedly get rid of COVID-19. It can't eradicate poverty. It can't defeat racism, and it can't stop climate change. And even if we all, as design professionals, became 100% focused on these issues tomorrow, I still don't think that we could do it. But all designers can reevaluate their role, remembering that whatever our role is, the one thing that it is not is neutral. Identifying the ways, big or small, that we can use design to catalyze positive change is essential to our work and our work as design professionals shaping the built environment. So I'll end this portion of the conversation today by saying, and I think this is particularly true for the students that are still in school studying landscape or design, but is relevant to all of us, that you should really take the time to understand the responsibility you carry with each design decision you make, not as a way to overwhelm or paralyze you, but really to emphasize that you have the power to make a difference very concretely in people's lives through design, and that everything you do or don't do is inherently not neutral and has a big impact. So thank you for your time this evening, and I'll hand the conversation back over to Justin.
Thank you, Lauren. So I'd like to invite Jerome and Chelina into the conversation as well. And I'd also like to remind for all of you folks at home, feel free to join the conversation yourself, log on into YouTube and submit any questions or comments you might have, and we'd be happy to address them. I'm just going to start off with maybe a few questions to get started with. And I think one thing that tags off to pretty well from your last few comments, Lauren. I think one thing that really struck me finding about the story of KDI is that in some ways it's reacting to previous work done in the space that maybe hadn't followed through on some of those implications. And so what I'd like to hear about a little is how does the work that you do with KDI play off and react maybe to some of the prior work that had been done in this space of professional designers working with under-resourced communities? What are you trying to carry forward, perhaps from some of those traditions or attempts? And what are you really reacting against and trying to do better at? I think it'd be great to hear about.
Yeah, I can take a first talk about that a little bit and hand it off to Chelina and Jerome as well. I'd say something that we pretty clearly react against, I guess, to go to the last part of the question, and is really in the way that we thought about, or at least the founders thought about, and Chelina included, the practice is that very often in design schools, and in the practice at large, there's a lot of emphasis put on the designer as the sole creator or author of a design. And at best, that creates a situation where you come to a community and say, A or B, which one do you like? Put a Post-it on it. And that's considered community engagement. And we are really committed to flipping that script a little bit and thinking about, community members are the ones who have all of this information. They have the lived experience. They know what they need in their communities. I've found that community members are probably the savviest designers that I've ever met. And so using that information to then sort of crowdsource into what the design should be. And then our role as designers is to build on that, translate that, and sort of use it as a jumping off point that is then iterated on multiple times with community members. And so that sort of simple changing of perspective has been really at the heart of everything we do. On top of that, I'd say that we have a very, sort of building on past tradition, we have a very strong focus on how do you bring the highest quality of design to these communities. So whether it be in its aesthetics and the way that it's built and the materials that it uses. Obviously, we work with very low budgets most of the time. And so I think there's a lot of innovation that has happened, but also is continuing to happen, to how can we focus on that accessible piece of design that really foregrounds, this aesthetic high quality that to these communities that don't see that type of work very often. So Chelina or Jerome, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add to that as well.
Sure. Thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Justin, and to the rest of your colleagues for having us here today and for having us with you this semester. It's really an honor. One other thing I would add, this firm, this practice had the luxury of starting within an academic setting. And what that allowed us to do was to kind of study everything that went wrong in detail. So a lot of our kind of founding principles were direct responses to all the case studies and time that we spent learning about failures. And one thing that we both learned through the study of things that went wrong, and then we're told again in our very first project in Kenya, has become foundational to how we practice today. And that's this idea of just showing up over and over again. When we started our work in Kenya, it was a 2-week project. And without going too much into the details, what we learned from residents was that we weren't the first group to come to Kibera, this informal settlement, to study the problems. We weren't the first group to come and suggest solutions. But when we showed up again a year later, we may have been among the first groups to be there more than once. Because traditionally what has happened in not just Kibera, but many low-income communities is is people come, they take what they need, or they leave something that they think is useful, and that's kind of the end of the relationship. But of course, as designers, we're trained to think in terms of systems. And so it makes sense that we would be committed to a place over the long term. So in our practice today, that means not just showing up more than once throughout the design process of a specific project, as Lauren was talking about, that kind of iterative community process, but it also means staying in that community to begin to link interventions to one another. And being an interdisciplinary firm, that's something that we can really do in a way that we believe is impactful. So just in some of the projects that Lauren showed, the way that the network of public spaces then was overlaid with the second project of a network of transportation and access networks, I think is a good example of something we are responding to as maybe a failure of other approaches to community development in the past, where maybe they come in just to work on the parks or just to work on the transportation, but of course you need both to really grow impact.
I guess I would just add, when I'm thinking about what traditions or other practices do we follow in, I think of maybe a Venn diagram with a big circle of all the design and planning practices that impact the built environment. And we occupy maybe a sometimes lonely niche within that in terms of who we work with and where we work. But still, it's within, using the same tools and language and processes that any designer, any landscape architect, say, is familiar with. And we can be inspired by and energized by lots of precedents and projects. And what's nice is we are also part of this big circle of activists and organizers and like-minded government officials and policy experts who are fighting for social justice day in, day out. And similarly, we might occupy a niche within that focuses on the design and transformation of the built environment. But we can still be energized and inspired by those folks as well. So between those two worlds, there's enough, I think, to keep us all going.
Thanks. I think that latches on nicely to something else I've been curious about, which is, because you take this model of really staying with places, making a commitment to places. One thing that you see as you look at the history of KDI, as Chelina mentions, it starts really with the projects in Kenya, and then grows out from there. And one thing I'm curious about, how do you make the decision about sort of where to make that commitment, and how to sort of strategically make commitments you feel like you can really follow through with?
Great question. I'm happy to start, and feel free to add, Lauren and Jerome. At the beginning, it was of our practice, it was very, there were a lot of stars that aligned to put us in the first few places where we started to work. It was really about relationships. One of our co-founders is Kenyan and from Nairobi. And so that's how we ended up beginning our work there. And then when we came, one thing that we had as a kind of a theoretical principle was that we were designing a model of practice that would be useful not just in Nairobi, but would be useful in other contexts that were facing similar challenges. And so once we kind of made the commitment to go from KDI being a kind of a side hustle and projects that we did in our free time to a permanent full-time practice, we also committed to testing that theory, that the model that we had been working under and developing could be useful in other places. And as one of the people that kind of took KDI into that next phase, I was interested in doing that in what was my backyard, which was Southern California particularly. So that led us to the Eastern Coachella Valley. And then as a third kind of area of focus, we went even closer to my literal backyard, which was Los Angeles, and began to work in that region. So that's how we ended up with those 3 areas of focus where still quite a lot of our work is rooted. But after those 3 were set in stone, we had to kind of have a more, something that was less about who we knew or where we were from, and more structured as a formula for how we decided where we could work. And to be honest, we're still kind of figuring out that formula, but what a few things that we do know through the testing process is that it really, because of the intensely participatory nature of our work, proximity, physical proximity, and real community connections are essential. So there was a moment in which we had been invited or asked to do some work in Haiti, and we did that through the community partner that had invited us. But in evaluating our work over a couple of projects there, we recognized that unless we could make that commitment to setting up a local office and being there over a longer time horizon, that we probably weren't best suited to do that work. And so that's the kind of evaluation that we make anytime we are invited to work in other places or asked to lend expertise. And we've just begun to figure out ways that we can expand our geographic footprint. But also we begin to do things where we ask ourselves if the best way for us to have an impact is for us to actually carry out an entire project process on behalf or in a particular place, or if we can be just as impactful by advising a process of local actors carry out within their kind of more familiar jurisdiction. And now our projects that are outside of our particular geographic kind of footprints fall into either one of those categories. Like we've determined we can do it because of particular partnerships, or we've determined that we can be a really good advisor to those that are more local.
Anything to add on, Jerome or Lauren?
I
Maybe
don't know, I think, go ahead,
yeah,
Jerome.
I think that's probably fine. I was just going to say, we will sometimes be asked to work on a project in a place, as Chelina said, it's outside of our geographic focuses, but falls within our other criteria of who we want to work with and our project expertise. And then, as she also mentioned, we're still discussing how do we define our expertise, because I think there's always need, and because there's always need, there's always going to be opportunities to do work that if we're not doing it, I'm not sure who else is going to do it. And that might lead us down paths where we develop new expertise. I think that's exactly what we did with the mobility plans. So it is a balancing act of not trying to do everything, but still being very ambitious in what we think we could have an impact on. And just to give an example, over the summer, we were engaged in a project that, because of COVID, the client suddenly basically stopped the project, talked to residents in this public housing development we were working with about what was now the priority for them. And one of those things was broadband access, which many of them lacked. So without any prior experience working on this issue, we launched a pilot project to, in partnership with a group in New York that had done these kinds of projects, where we trained residents on how to build the hardware for and install a temporary community Wi-Fi network that we're now looking to expand into a larger South LA-wide initiative. But that, again, that's the kind of need that arose that we felt like this was important for us to do, even if it fell outside of our technical expertise up to that point.
Lauren?
I'm not sure I have much to add to that. I mean, I agree with both points, and we often sort of find ourselves in these moments of filling a gap and sort of teaching ourselves how to fly the plane as we are flying it, which makes it sound much more risky than I think it actually is. But yeah, Jerome's absolutely right. When we started our mobility planning project, which I talked about and was managing, like, I'm trained as a landscape architect. I've never done transportation planning work before. And so the first month, my colleague and I just spent a lot of time reading transportation plans, which are, no offense to the transportation planners in the office, they're not like Pulitzer Prize winning pros. So, but I think that we all are really willing to think about, or because we have these personal connections to folks in these communities now from doing work with them over a long period of time, it's very clear how something that may seem dry, like a mobility plan, will have actual tangible improvements to people's lives. And that certainly makes the sort of reading of those many hundreds of pages a much more sort of motivating thing. And so I feel like I've gained all sorts of expertise that I didn't have 3.5 years ago when I started at KDI because of similar situations like that. And I think that allows us to be a very nimble and adaptable organization in a way that many for-profit, but not necessarily because they are for-profit, organizations don't have the luxury or the ability to sort of embody, because they have other sort of client restrictions or restrictions in the way that their businesses are set up.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite origin stories for projects that were developed before my time. But the idea is not that we as an organization or as individuals wanted to do transportation plans. It's that in order to correct this injustice in the built environment, total lack of transportation infrastructure, you have to create a transportation plan to get federal dollars to make physical improvements to the built environment. So given that that's the only step that will unlock that funding and result in that change, we taught ourselves how to write transportation plans. So that's the kind of, I think, opportunistic and strategic decisions and I guess skill learning that we can bring.
And maybe just to say, we do have kind of a limit to that. We try to only teach ourselves expertise that are somehow adjacent to our training. So we try, sometimes we think, oh, well, could we, it feels like there needs to be some, conflict resolution training for the groups in this community. And we very often get to the line like, well, we could do that, couldn't we? And then we think, no, actually, maybe we could, but we are landscape architects and urban planners. Somebody knows how to do that better than us. So I think sometimes one thing we often struggle with in the office across a lot of categories is how to say no and how to really focus in on the places where our training allows us to have the greatest impact. Add that.
Great. Now, I want to circle back around to something that you said, Lauren, and maybe, having been kind of adjacent to people in the nonprofit world for a while, you tend to sometimes think of nonprofits in terms of the restrictions that they have to observe, the level of reporting that has to be done, or certainly like the sort of scramble for funding. And what I heard you saying is that there's also like this space of opportunity that defining yourselves as a nonprofit opens up as well. Could you all talk about that a little?
Sure. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like, working at a nonprofit is like hanging out by the swimming pool or something. It's certainly like quite hard as well in many different ways. But I think what I've found as someone who was working in for-profit practice prior to coming here is that many landscape firms do not end up in the position of being a prime on a contract very often. There are some very well-known firms like Michael Van Valkenburg or West 8 or Field Ops who have the ability to really use their expertise and cachet to do that. But what I've really found like sort of transformational about KDI is because we are a nonprofit, we are able to, as I talked about in this presentation, self-initiate a lot of the work that we do. And so as part of that, you're able to either create new projects that we know need to happen or are part of our mission, or we can use additional funding or sort of cobbled together foundation funding from here and there to be able to augment what would normally just be a pretty, standard RFP or something like that. So we're able to actually have a lot of sway and ability to shape projects in the way that we would like to see them, as opposed to the way that, your standard county transportation department would sort of spit out an RFP to you. So that's been, I think, quite an interesting experience of really thinking through what that nimbleness and adaptability can allow you to do as a nonprofit, as opposed to a for-profit firm that has to, is a little more restricted in the types of projects that they could go after because they're merely responding to something as opposed to creating it. Now, I do know that there are a lot of for-profit firms that are trying to change that either through research work or through sort of some sort of meld of a nonprofit arm or an innovation arm. And so it's becoming more of a gray area, I think, which is great, of this sort of like nonprofit, for-profit mesh. But for many traditional firms, that's not really an option. And so that's been, I think, one of the, maybe there are many ways that a nonprofit is preferable over a for-profit firm, but that's the first one that comes to mind for me.
And maybe just to add, I think there's a kind of a myth, maybe because there are so few design nonprofits, so nobody, including us, really know how it's supposed to go. But I think one of the myths is that you're kind of in one world or you're in the other. You're in the for-profit way of getting work, or you're in the nonprofit way. And that is a myth, at least in our case, because we really do both. So we do compete against and team with for-profit firms all the time to go after a very traditional RFP. In our case, we do that when the RFP aligns with our mission, meaning it's in a low-income community of color, or it's addressing an issue that we're already working on. But we often look like a very traditional firm on paper in the way that we get work. And then sometimes we don't. Sometimes when that traditional channel we don't feel like it's really addressing a need, then we have this other track that we can pursue. And to echo what Lauren said, that doesn't mean it's easy, or doesn't mean like, you kind of have double the possibility for revenue now. I don't want to suggest that, but I do think that there's a really nice flexibility that comes with it that allows you to shape the direction of your portfolio in a way that can be, I think, quite liberating. And just to kind of give you an example from our own practice, when we look across our portfolio, just about 50% of our projects are self-initiated and through one of the 5 processes that or tactics that Lauren shared in her presentation today.
Any thoughts on that one, Jerome?
I'm like a nonprofit lifer. I've been doing this for a while. I've had a for-profit job for 9 months. 15 years. When I came out of grad school, I worked for field operations, managing fresh kills for a little under a year. And I left to go to the first in a series of nonprofits that deal with urbanism, cities, neighborhoods, design and planning advocacy in some way. And actually, New York is lousy with nonprofits. They're all over the place, and any given night, you know, there'll be an exhibit or a program or a design project unveiling. So a lot of groups there. I think maybe other cities, including LA, don't have that kind of nonprofit ecosystem in the design and planning worlds. But yeah, just to echo what Lauren and Chelina have said, it can be very liberating as a designer. I think it opens up a lot more direct relationships with people that we're designing with. It opens up a much broader field of topics and projects that you could potentially take on. And then, as both Chelina and Lauren have talked about, it just gives you a little more agency to choose what you want to focus on.
So I'm going to make a pivot towards some of the audience questions that have been coming in, and some great ones here. I'm going to start with something that's already come up briefly, which is really the pandemic. And one of the questions in the chat, what was your focus during the height of the pandemic? I'd say which height of the pandemic, and what happened with your projects? Did they go on pause? What were some of the scenarios you've been seeing?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been a hard year, of course. Like Los Angeles County and Riverside County, which is where the Eastern Coachella Valley is located, have been really hard hit as part of it and continue to be quite hard hit as part of COVID. And obviously we are all still living in Zoomlandia. But I think what it sort of highlighted to us are 2 main things that we were struggling with as part of it is, one, that a lot of the communities we work with don't have reliable internet access. And that's something that Jerome talked about previously in one of the projects he was referencing over the summer. I think it's something that we often take for granted that, you know, pivoting to online, no problem. But when that's not something that's available for community members, it makes this type of interaction, whether it be for school or work or whatever it may be, quite difficult. And the second was, how do you have a community-based engagement practice in a time where you cannot be face-to-face with folks? And one thing that we did in the Eastern Coachella Valley was our community organizers who are based out there started a Facebook Live group called Derribando Barreras, which means breaking down barriers, right, Chelina? And through that Facebook Live group, it had a couple of different focuses. One was to just disseminate information on what was happening. A lot of the information was either being not heard by residents, or it wasn't translated into Spanish. Many of the folks that live in the Eastern Coachella Valley are either monolingual or prefer Spanish as their language. There are a lot of folks who are considered essential workers as part of the agricultural industry. And so getting information about what was happening, like, why is there no toilet paper on any shelf? I haven't heard of anything that's going on, was really important. And then the other portions of that program were also to just bring some levity to people in this time of, bringing local artists to perform as part of it, having mariachi bands perform on the Facebook Live feed, like how to bring folks the ability to sort of like relax for a little bit and feel like they're part of a community when everyone's stuck at home, and doing like arts and crafts almost, so that you could bring your kid and like do something with them or allow them to be part of this program. And so I thought that was like one of the most sort of really like immediate responses, successful responses to this work in a community that had not been prepared in the way that we all sort of were inundated with COVID information, that just hadn't been getting to these communities. And so we were filling this sort of like communication gap that had existed in that area. But that's just sort of one way that we've been thinking about COVID. And luckily, not a lot of our projects have actually gone on hold, I would say. It's been sort of like a lot of changing timelines, I guess I'll say. All of a sudden things get really, really fast, and then they sort of stop for a little bit, and then they speed up again. So I think we're lucky in that it hasn't felt like all of our work has suddenly dried up, but it's been more of a changing target, I suppose, is how I would describe the projects we're working on.
Any other experiences or thoughts to share about that one?
I'll just throw out one thing that we've just started thinking about. So it's just a kernel of an idea, but the same neighborhoods that have been hardest hit by the pandemic, infection rates, death rates, they're way higher than average in LA, and this is true, around the country, are the same ones that have endured decades of exclusionary, racist city building practices, policies. And those communities are not going to go back to normal when the vaccine finally arrives. There's going to be long-term health impacts, employment impacts, educational impacts. So it seems like there should be targeted investments in those neighborhoods and in those communities to improve infrastructure. And what could that look like? How could residents in those neighborhoods make those decisions? How could we unlock funding for that? That's something we'd like to think about more over the next year or so.
We had a few questions here that ask you to share a little more about specific tactics for some of your projects. So one person interested in learning more about the process of the walk audit. I'm not sure if any of you were directly involved at Le Favorite.
Sure. A walk audit is something that we use often in our work, part of our toolbox of participatory activities that really flip the power dynamic and also the way that knowledge flows. So, which is something that we look to do as kind of a core strategy within our engagement process. And so, the walk audit, I think there's a very technical walk audit procedure in the world of transportation planning. We take a loose interpretation of it and maybe reinterpret it often. But essentially, what it does for us is it's a simple approach that says, we want the people who live in this place, and in the case of the Argentina project, that was women who lived in the community of La Favorita, to show us their community in a way that we wouldn't see it if we were just walking on our own. And then on top of that, evaluate it in a way that they may not evaluate it if they were just walking through the community on their own. So it becomes kind of a reciprocal exchange of knowledge, in that we bring a little bit of technical guidance to help people see things like a crack in the sidewalk in a way that they may not typically interpret it. And we see things like a corner plaza that nobody is sitting in, and we begin to understand why in a way that we wouldn't if we just walked past to see it empty. And so, it can be, again, like I said, it can be interpreted to work in many different ways depending on what the project goals are or the project aim is. But I think the core tenets of it are to help the average resident see their built environment through a more technical, critical perspective, and to help the technical folks, that usually us in this case, see the built environment through a more human, familial, day-to-day perspective. So that somewhere with having both types of knowledge at your disposal through a design process, you lead to a better outcome.
Great, thanks. Another one that came up, and something that you had mentioned before, Lauren, is sometimes having the sort of constraints of budget driving innovation. One person asking about, when you're working within a budget, how do you sort of choose priorities, or how do you appropriately scale what you're looking to do? I know, Lauren, earlier on this week, we had sort of a conversation about kind of starting with budgets as much as possible, and having kind of trying to be frank up front about possibilities that are there. Is that something you could enlarge on?
Sure. I think it's, I don't know why folks are sort of scared to talk about money when it comes to this sort of thing, but we try and be very upfront with community members, like what are the budgets that we're working with? And we work with whoever our funder or client, whoever is sort of the end kind of entity using the project, to understand very clearly what parameters are we working with. So if there's something we hear quite a lot in the Eastern Coachella Valley is about public streetlights. Those do not exist in the community, and it's something that people really want. But through some of our transportation work, it became clear that actually is not part of the purview of the county transportation office. So it's something that we're trying to pursue elsewhere or through another channel, but being very clear with community members about where the parameters are to be able to implement something that can be practical, built, and done through this process, I think is really, really useful. And the second thing that we do to prioritize, which is a great question, is using a technique called participatory budgeting. And so that in the most radical way is actually giving part of the budget to community members to decide how to use. But what we often do is also, I'll use the mobility plan as an example as well. One of the things we did was created this poker game for folks and said, like, all right, each one of you gets 10 poker chips and a map. And so with those 10 poker chips, you can buy differently priced pieces of infrastructure and place them on your map. So you can buy with 1 chip a mile of sidewalk, or 2 chips a mile of sidewalk with a streetscape, or with 3 chips you could buy a roundabout, or whatever it may be, and create your own mobility plans. So people are working within the constraints of budget, which I think most people actually understand. Of you can't buy everything in the grocery store, you're working with a specific amount of money. And that process was really interesting because like groups of 5 or 6 people would be like, well, what if we pool our money together? And so then we can like actually get really great infrastructure in front of the school where it should really be. Or, you know, thinking about one group of residents wrote a petition to the bank to get more funding. But I think this sort of like democratic consensus process of working within parameters, having some sort of constraint, but then giving people the opportunity to help us decide what the priorities should be and how we should focus our implementation dollars is a pretty powerful one, and not something that is normally done through more traditional engagement processes where, at least in my experience with some of the state work around the Salton Sea, there's a lot of reticence about giving that type of freedom to community members because there's a misunderstanding that when you do a community process, the obvious result is going to be a community that is against whatever your project is. There's this very like reactionary idea to this. But really, when you build community engagement in from the beginning, more often than not, you end up in a place of consensus. And yes, there are disagreements along the way. There are places of friction and places where you need to sort of like tread lightly. But for the most part, it ends up with this process that community members were a part of. And so they buy into that process and they buy into this sort of longer term stewardship of a place. And so whoever is funding it, the state, county, whomever, ends up investing their dollars into an amenity that people use and serves their community the best. And so it's really a win-win, but often it's sort of seen as like something that will blow up my budget or screw over my timeline or do something to create opposition to the project. And that's often just not the case.
I think one last thing I would like to talk about is, you know, we're coming up on, if I have my numbers straight, 15 years of KDI. One thing I'd like to hear about a bit is how you sustain a practice like this. What keeps it, you know, what keeps burnout away? What keeps you engaged? What keeps you from falling into a sort of set routine? One thing I know from already starting to talk to you folks is how much each project really is its own entity and something that takes on its own life. How does it work that you keep something like this going for so long?
Well, I think one thing that I can say across all of the fantastic people that make up KDI is that everyone intentionally sought out this mode of practice. Nobody, at least to my knowledge, has come to KDI just because they're looking for a place to get a paycheck. And so that goes a long way. People have come to this mode of practice because they have seen other modes of practice that are less preferable to them. So that's a kind of a foundational piece. Then I think from a more practical side, how do you keep the practice going? That I don't think there's anything too like special about doing that for KDI than really any other practice. It's just about, you know, all of the logistics and the nuts and bolts of creating a sustainable practice that apply to any firm. So, you know, doing great work, building a reputation for being able to work on specific types of projects or in specific places, building a client base. In our case, client means about 15 different things, but really having those relationships and building on them. And then I think one thing that I hope is part of what has helped us keep going this long and will help us into the future is the way that we apply equity and inclusion to our internal practice as a firm. And of course, it's what we lead with in our external work, but it's really critical to me as a co-founder and as the director that is just as visible and present throughout the internal side of the firm. So of course, just like any design firm, we have deadlines, we have extra hours, we have all of those things that are just part and parcel of what it means to choose these professions. But we really take extra care to find ways to offset that through our benefits packages, through our different policies around time off, et cetera. And so that is one of the things that we do as part of kind of our core principles, but we hope that it also helps address things like how you keep someone going and how you avoid burnout within a team or within a staff.
Mm-hmm.
And I can add a little bit. I'm a relative newbie being here for 3.5 years, but Chelina's last point about sort of having equity and inclusion as part of our practice, I think, or our internal practice, I think something that Chelina and Jerome and our other director, Melissa, do quite well is put an emphasis on sort of growing the professional development of the folks that are in our office, as opposed to sort of just hiring over them whenever there's an opening or a need to. And that I think actually is really kind of radical almost, in that it helps you feel not only like a valued part of the organization, but also that your voice is important in making decisions as to what the direction of the office should be, the types of projects that we go after, how do our values sort of translate into the work that we do. And that to me is really, really important and allows for the sort of exploration as just like a person in the world to be able to think about design from different angles and feel like you can have a trajectory within an office, even if there's no clear sort of position title for that as well. And, we're not a flat organization. I don't think flat organizations work, to be totally honest, but I think there's a level of sort of democracy within it that still gives enough hierarchy to have some sort of structure and ability to make decisions, but also a feeling that if you have an issue or something that you'd like to continue on, or an opportunity, that it's not only for the directors to decide, but it's something that our entire office really comes together and talks about and moves forward, as opposed to just sort of the organization hinging on the design aesthetic or the decision-making process or the direction set by one person, which is often the case within design offices.
Jerome, any final thoughts on walking the walk in the institution?
I think maybe just to echo what Lauren and Chelina have talked about, I'm constantly impressed by our staff. Most recently, I had this thought. We were doing a racial justice audit of our projects. Definitely, this process is a work in process, but we're committed to looking closely and critically at all of our work, anything that anyone in the office is involved with, and how can, across a series of criteria that we've developed, how are we doing in terms of achieving racial justice outcomes? And just the conversation that came out of that 2-hour-long process from everyone in the office just showed the level of like just independent thought that people are putting into their work. And I think that has a lot to do with, as Chelina said, it's a self-selecting group of people, but also they're given room to do this. And I think probably if I had stuck it out longer at field operations and gotten to be in a senior position, I could be saying the same thing, you know, for the people there in terms of their impressiveness in one way or another. It's probably true at a lot of firms, but it's really, I feel like, a hallmark of the people at KDI. Their commitment to this kind of work and the agency they get to take with it that helps explain longevity.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Chelina, Jerome, Lauren, for joining us. It's been great to have you. And for all of you at home, please join us again next week where Andrew Sargent will be our guest. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.